I think the sector that's been most affected, or one of the most affected by coronavirus, is in the retail, hospitality, and restaurant world. You drive down the street, you walk down the street, it's very obvious. Stores are closed. Restaurants are keeping the lights on by doing things such as delivery or takeout only, or really getting creative with what they're doing to try to keep the doors open until we get to the other side of this pandemic. So I was very excited when Jacob Cooper, the managing director of MSC Retail here in Philadelphia, agreed to speak with me for a few minutes about the current state of the retail market here in Philadelphia and around the country, some interesting strategies retailers are taking to get to the other side of this, and also what he thinks the future of retail has in store for us when we do eventually get back to something that resembles life as normal. So hopefully you all find this informative and stay safe out there. All right, this is Dan Ritterman with Tactix Real Estate Advisors. Very excited because I think everyone kind of knows that the retail world's been really affected by this, whether it's your favorite store or restaurant. So today I'm talking with Jacob Cooper, who's a partner and managing director here at MSC Retail in Philadelphia. A lot of what we're going to talk about is focused on Philadelphia, but I think is likely applicable to sort of like the wider market of what's going on in the world. So Jacob, thanks for chatting with me. And why don't you introduce yourself and talk about MSC a little bit?
Thanks for having me, Dan. MSC Retail is a commercial real estate brokerage based here in Philadelphia with offices in Los Angeles and New York City. And our primary focus is, as Dan mentioned, as you mentioned, the retail, restaurant, and hospitality world. So we are experts at that specific niche and asset class within the real estate market, and we advise both tenants and landlords on their both lease and sale transactions.
So I think you and I ran into each other about a month, maybe 6 weeks ago. It feels like an eternity ago. A lot's changed since then. So
Sure.
what are you sort of seeing on the street in the retail world in Philadelphia about how sort of the coronavirus has affected the local community here?
So obviously, all retail and restaurant businesses, aside from life-sustaining businesses like grocery and pharmacy, remain shuttered right now. So we are mostly thinking about two primary things. First is consulting with existing clients on how to speak with and in some cases negotiate with their landlords, or speaking with landlords and about how to speak with their tenants on how to approach a conversation about rent deferral or rent abatement. And we're finding there really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to that. It's really coming on a case-by-case basis based on what your business is, who for example, who your landlord is, what your business is, what you're selling, and what position you are in this particular environment. But for the most part, the climate is not great right now, as you can imagine. We're not exactly sure how this is going to impact moving forward, both on the short term and a long term basis. But it's a scary time for everyone, and there's no doubt that this will have a pretty drastic impact on specifically the retail, the ground floor world of real estate, largely with the increased vacancy, most likely, and depressed rents. It will be what we can characterize as a tenants market moving forward post COVID.
Well, we haven't seen a tenants market in Philadelphia in quite some time. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of see that, at least in the office world, we haven't. I did my first video that I released on LinkedIn about strategies tenants should consider when they approach their landlord for rent relief. They were to be open and honest about your situation, explain why coronavirus is creating a temporary crisis for your business while you'll be stronger on the other side, and what you want to offer to your landlord in exchange for specifically what you're asking for, right? And those were kind of my things. What have you seen in terms of how landlords and tenants are approaching this? Because our understanding is most leases don't really cover this, right? There likely is not any kind of relief that is guaranteed as a matter of right in these leases as they're drafted. You have to review your own lease, of course. Every lease is different, but how are you seeing landlords and tenants approaching that problem?
My first recommendation would be to approach a conversation without the lease as the guiding document for the conversation. The leases are documents that really they do outline kind of the what if something happens scenario, and this is perhaps you could characterize as one of those scenarios that are unanticipated. But at the same time, for me, this is a conversation that has to start with certainly compassion, understanding, and what I will call perhaps the most important word in what the conversation needs to have, which is really a partnership. It is quite common, as you know, in negotiation. It's strange. You have a landlord and tenant relation that's typically consummated in an adversarial way, right? You engage in a negotiation when you start out a lease that can be filled with anxiety and filled with strong emotion and perhaps even anger or negativity. And you're supposed to start this really wonderful, what's supposed to be a long-standing relationship that's mutually beneficial. And I think my recommendation both to landlords and tenants would be to start this conversation with that compassion and with that idea of partnership, because especially in the retail and restaurant world, that's what's going to be the key to success moving forward in the coming years. It's going to be a shared risk profile for operations. I mean, no one knows what the impact of COVID will be on, for example, general sales of retail, general restaurant volumes. And that's really what affords tenants the ability to pay rent. And when we really don't know what the impact on gross revenue is going to be within the four walls of a retail establishment, there's no way to anticipate how much these operations or operators can afford to pay rent. So we're going into this conversation somewhat flying blind, but as long as the conversation can also anticipate those unknowns and perhaps provide some future flexibility to allow for some future modification, call it end of summer, in the fall, at the end of the calendar year 2020, just to look back and say, hey, this is really what we were able to achieve. This is how the business was truly impacted. Let's come to a partnership and come to an agreement moving forward that takes into account that modification.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. We talked briefly before we jumped on here about how the crystal ball is cloudy right now.
Yes.
We all kind of know we're in the middle of something, but we're not quite sure what the other side of it looks like. And that makes it very difficult to negotiate sort of like a very long-term solution between landlords and tenants right now. That makes a lot of sense. It seems like the businesses that survive, though, are going to be ones that are sort of able to pivot and maybe do something unique right now to try to get themselves through this time. I know some restaurants, at least out where I am in the suburbs, they're taking on more of a grocery store role right now, where they're ordering large amounts of produce from their suppliers and they're selling those kinds of things for pickup and delivery. Have you seen any of your clients kind of maybe take an industry pivot or just try like a unique strategy to kind of change things up for right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the food and beverage world is a great example. As you mentioned, a lot of restaurant tenants and clients of ours are utilizing the strength of their brand and pushing out messages via social media to allow them to stay relevant with the consumer. I think I've spoken a lot about delivery and takeout, and that will be certainly more prevalent for the remainder of the year. And what we're working with our clients on is how to pivot to that, not just within the four walls of their restaurant, but how are they, for example, how are they outsourcing some of the food production in other real estate locations, other modules. And that's a whole nother discussion, talking about offsite cloud kitchens and commercial kitchens and whatnot. But yeah, it's certainly not easy for restaurants to stay relevant, and it really is more of a branding and marketing exercise rather than an operations exercise, just because it's a highly competitive world right now when you take out experience and when you take out location from the decision making of the consumer, and everyone's basically on the same playing field of a website, for example, that showcases 250 delivery options. You really have to rely on the nostalgia or the brand strength, or even the quality of the food that was everyone may remember pre-COVID. So a lot of the restaurateurs and a lot of the food and beverage operators are having to remind the consumer about that, really that in-store, bring that in experience into the home. And that's really a challenge, but it's more of a marketing challenge than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I have background in the food delivery space, first at mainline delivery, and then at Caviar,
That's
who's
right.
much more at
That's
door.
right. I forgot. Yeah, sure.
I was joking around with somebody recently that food delivery is unlikely rise to the essential status. I never thought that would be the case, but yeah, they're playing an important role, and we've seen a lot of restaurants who were reluctant to get on those services before are now racing to come back. But you're right. When you talk to these restaurant owners, so much of what goes into what they love is the experience of what they're building and inviting people into this space they've created. And it's just not the food itself is part of the bigger picture, and it doesn't necessarily translate so out of the takeout. So we'll see. The other thing that I've kind of seen out of this whole COVID sort of crisis is trends that were already in motion have been sort of accelerated, right?
Sure.
The move to ghost kitchens was already in existence. Maybe it'll be accelerated now. The prevalence of sort of these larger chains or the mom and pops who maybe couldn't compete, that will maybe be accelerated a little bit from this. And I hope not, because the fabric of having both of those styles of restaurants, I think, is really what makes sort of places what they are.
Sure. And let me ask you a question.
Sure.
How do you think chefs and restaurateurs are really responding? Do you think they're responding positively to the idea of delivery and takeout? I mean, for me, there are, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into the operation of a restaurant, and most of that is really the in-store, in-restaurant experience. But the idea of taking orders from a computer and putting your food into takeout containers and then giving it to an unknown person that whisks it away off into the night there's no personal human connection with the consumer. And that's really, when you think about it, that's the strength of restaurants. That's the strength of brick and mortar, is the human connection, and that's completely lost in the activity of delivery. And my hope is that that's really what brings brick and mortar back, is that human connection and that experience. How do you balance and think about those two things as we kind of coexist, if they coexist in this new world that we're moving into?
Well, I think they'll have to coexist in the new world, because the same thing, I think, with this shift to remote work, actually, I think it's very similar, right? Where a lot of restaurants maybe didn't think their food, they could make a menu that worked out in a delivery sense. It wasn't conducive to that. Well, now they're realizing that maybe they can package things sort of family style or change the way they're doing things to be more conducive to delivery. So I think a lot like the shift to remote work, where a lot of these restaurants will stay on these delivery services because in a vacuum, they never would have even considered them. But now that they absolutely require them just to sort of survive, they'll realize that, actually I can do pretty well and people do still like my food, even though they're taking it out of the restaurant.
Right.
I used to say this to restaurant owners all the time. I still think a lot of people, they're not delivery customers. There's people who just want to go to restaurants, and there's people who just want to order delivery. And you can reach both of those consumers by offering both modes of eating your food, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same thing with the remote work, where some companies who never would have thought to do remote work in the first place, well, now they have to. And it turns out it actually does work out pretty well, right? Or if we do some investment into this and lay the infrastructure for it, this works just fine. And restaurants may find the same thing. So I think on the end of this, some restaurants will leave those delivery services and go back to the way that they were doing things if they're able to. But I think a lot of them will realize that actually these do play a role for me, especially in off hours where I can fill in some time and go off for dinner, or they'll at least fold it into their system. If not, all in with both feet, they'll realize that it's a useful piece to play, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I think we'll see that. And I think we're already seeing that. I know there are some out here in the suburbs, restaurants that I tried to sign for years, that are suspiciously quick to get on Caviar when they have to.
I think and I guess talking about the difference between suburban and urban delivery, I mean, the nature of suburban real estate allows for drop off, pickup, loading in a more seamless manner compared to here in the city, where there are takeout, makeshift takeout windows and all kinds of strange stuff that just it's very difficult to adapt within the four walls of an urban restaurant to convert to that type of operation, and especially with the vehicular access to these restaurants. There are not enough loading zones. There's no dedicated parking. It's very difficult.
That's a great point. And also
Yeah.
restaurants that in-house maybe aren't set up for delivery, because the delivery people coming in and out of the restaurant might take away from the experience they're trying to create. Well, there is no experience right now. So they can try the delivery for right now. But again, if they want to shift back, then I think there will be restaurants who decide that played a role in helping me get to the other side of this. Now let's go back to what was working for me before, which was what I really wanted to be doing in the first place. So I suppose that will be the case. And I think that kind of leads me nicely. So my last question for you, which is, what are the trends from this that will stay? Like, what does this look like 6 months, 1 year, 2 years out, when I think we all kind of agree there will be a return to somewhat normal, whatever that means, at some point in the future? What do you think that looks like in the retail world?
So in the retail world, I think certainly it means consolidation. There will be fewer tenants. Those tenants will therefore become a much more valuable commodity in the marketplace for landlords. I see more creative placemaking strategies driven by perhaps the most qualified and capitalized landlords. For example, office building owners, multifamily owners they're going to utilize retail as not just an income stream in a traditional sense that's on a rent roll, but more of a strategic placemaking and amenity driver for the asset above. Because that's really, I mean, we've been talking about this for years, thinking about what, I'll use the coffee example, right? You can always think about, Starbucks is somewhat of a ubiquitous name. And if you own a great corner and there isn't a Starbucks within 3 blocks from your location, they're probably going to take a hard look as long as you offer the corner, and they're going to give you great rent and credit. But providing a more local brand or amenity, or perhaps, depending on your taste in coffee, a higher quality product like a La Colombe or an Ultimo coffee or Reanimator coffee, something that brings that flair, that local flair, that can provide even more value than perhaps the income stream of a Starbucks. But aside from coffee, I mean, more importantly, I think the idea of combining these types of experience together. So hospitality with food and beverage, with some direct to consumer brands. I mean, all of that is driving a new retail experience that I think a lot of mixed use, primarily mostly urban and or lifestyle suburban owners are going to really strive for. And therefore, those types of deals are going to be less leading away from the traditional 5, 10, 15-year dedicated lease terms, and more of the partnerships, as I previously mentioned. They're going to be shared risk, perhaps more landlord contributions to the deals, more rent structures that are reflected or based upon performance of the actual of the actual establishment, like percentage rent structures or things like that. But I think that that's perhaps less applicable in some of the more less dense kind of traditional commercial corridor neighborhood retail, which is also going to be, I would anticipate going to struggle. I mean, small businesses coming out of this really are going to need support. Rents will have to, I hope, adjust down to a point where they can, that entrepreneurship, that commerce, that small business can begin to thrive again in small format retail spaces. But I really, I think that there's going to be an interesting shift. And finally, I'll give you one more tidbit. A branch of retail that I really do think is going to expand are what I'll call kind of co-located and curated retail product experiences. I'll give you, for example, Beta or Showfields or Anchor Shops. These are new retail concepts that provide a platform for direct-to-consumer brands that do not have the perhaps the financial backing to build out a full brick and mortar experience, they can integrate a few of their products within a larger curated experience in a space. These types of concepts can give them the back end technology platform to give them real-time data based on sales of certain products, and they're able to just a lot of these spaces are just going to have to become more flexible and more responsive to consumer behavior, because again, the old retail concepts that built out the store 15 years ago and never did a renovation and changed product every quarter or every third of the year. Those concepts are just no longer going to be able to compete.
Well, it's interesting because it kind of goes back to what I was saying about accelerating trends, where these were things that we were probably already seeing in the retail world, and now they'll play a probably more prevalent role in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Well, I really appreciate it. I think we're all rooting for our favorite restaurants and favorite retail shops to hang in there. So keep up the good work. I really appreciate your time. This was great talking to you.
Thanks for your time, Dan.
All right, stay safe out there.